This trade relationship was unequal. Egypt, under the powerful Middle Kingdom pharaohs, saw Nubia as a source of resources to be exploited. Around 1900 BCE, Pharaoh Senusret III launched a massive military campaign into Nubia, pushing Egyptian control south to the Second Cataract. He built a series of massive fortresses, the most sophisticated military architecture of the Bronze Age, to control the Nile and extract Nubian wealth. These fortresses were formidable. Thick walls, multiple gates, drawbridges, bastions, and moats protected Egyptian garrisons. The largest at Buhen covered over 7 acres and had walls over 10 meters high. Egypt was clearly taking the Nubian threat seriously. For 400 years, Kerma chafed under Egyptian domination, but the kingdom survived, maintaining its cultural identity and building its strength. The rulers of Kerma continued to be buried in massive tumuli, surrounded by hundreds of sacrifice servants who would accompany them to the afterlife, a practice that showed both the rulers' absolute power and a religious system distinct from Egypt's. Then around 1700 BCE, Egypt's Middle Kingdom collapsed. The Hyksos, Asiatic invaders, conquered northern Egypt. Egyptian authority in Nubia evaporated almost overnight. Kerma's moment had come. The kingdom expanded rapidly, pushing north past the abandoned Egyptian fortresses. Kerma forces occupied the fortresses themselves, turning them into Nubian strongholds. At its peak, around 1650 BCE, the kingdom of Kerma controlled the Nile Valley from the Fourth Cataract all the way north to the First Cataract at Aswan, the border of Hyksos-controlled Egypt. The Kerma civilization reached its apex. The capital city grew to cover 25 hectares with massive mud brick buildings, including the famous Defufa, a temple structure over 18 meters tall that still stands today, the oldest standing structure in sub-Saharan Africa. Kerma had become a great power, dealing with Egypt as an equal. Diplomatic letters show that the Hyksos, as rulers of northern Egypt, and the kings of Kerma communicated as allies, possibly coordinating against the Egyptian resistance forces gathering in Thebes. But Egypt would not remain divided forever. Around 1550 BCE, the princes of Thebes launched a war of liberation against the Hyksos. They developed new military technology, the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, bronze-scale armor, and forged a new Egyptian state, the New Kingdom. These New Kingdom pharaohs were warrior kings, unlike any Egypt had seen before, and they had long memories. Egypt had been humiliated by the Hyksos invasion. Nubia had taken advantage of Egypt's weakness. Now Egypt would have its revenge. Pharaoh Thutmose I struck first around 1500 BCE. His armies swept south, smashing through Nubian defenses and pushing deep into Kerma territory. His son Thutmose II continued the conquest, but it was Thutmose III, Egypt's Napoleon, who delivered the final blow. Around 1450 BCE, Thutmose III's armies destroyed Kerma. The capital was burned, the kingdom was dismantled. For the first time in 1,000 years, Nubia ceased to exist as an independent political entity. What followed was nearly 500 years of Egyptian occupation, the longest colonial period in African history. The New Kingdom pharaohs didn't just conquer Nubia, they attempted to Egyptianize it. They built massive temples to Egyptian gods throughout Nubia. They installed Egyptian administrators. They educated the sons of Nubian chiefs in Egyptian schools, teaching them to speak Egyptian and worship Egyptian gods. Pharaoh Ramesses II exemplified this cultural imperialism. He built the magnificent temples at Abu Simbel deep in Nubia, with colossal statues of himself carved into the living rock, a permanent declaration of Egyptian dominance. For Nubian culture, this was a disaster. The Kema civilization's distinctive pottery styles disappeared. Indigenous religious practices went underground. The Nubian language survived, but Egyptian became the language of power and prestige. Yet the Nubians were not passive victims. They served in Egyptian armies, rising to high ranks. They worked as administrators, managing Egyptian interests in their homeland. And slowly, gradually, they absorbed Egyptian culture, not as subjects, but as equals and eventually as inheritors. By 1100 BCE, the elite of Nubia were thoroughly Egyptianized. They worshipped Amun. They built Egyptian-style temples. They wrote in hieroglyphics. They mummified their dead according to Egyptian practices. But here's the crucial point. They didn't see this as abandoning their identity. They saw themselves as becoming the true keepers of Egyptian civilization, more Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves. This would matter greatly in the centuries to come. Around 1070 BCE, the new kingdom of Egypt collapsed. Civil war, foreign invasions, and economic crisis tore Egypt apart. Egyptian authority in Nubia crumbled. Egyptian administrators fled north. And into this vacuum stepped a new Nubian power, the kingdom of Napata, centered on the city of Napata at the Fourth Cataract, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Bakal. This new kingdom was different from more ancient Kama. These Nubians had thoroughly absorbed Egyptian culture, but they were building something new, a synthesis of Nubian independence and Egyptian civilization. The kings of Napata presented themselves as the legitimate successors to Egypt's pharaohs. They adopted Egyptian royal titles. They built Egyptian-style pyramids for their tombs. They worshipped Amun as their supreme god. But they ruled from Nubia, not Egypt, and they governed according to Nubian traditions. For 3 centuries, Napata grew in power and wealth. The kingdom controlled the gold mines of the Nubian desert. It dominated trade routes connecting Egypt with the African interior. Its armies became formidable, equipped with bronze weapons and manned by legendary Nubian archers. Meanwhile, Egypt continued its decline. The Third Intermediate Period saw Egypt fragment into competing kingdoms. Libyan dynasties ruled in the north. Egyptian petty kingdoms quarreled in the south. The great temples fell into disrepair. The old religious traditions were neglected. To the Kushite kings watching from Napata, this was intolerable. Egypt, the mother civilization, the land of the gods, was being desecrated by weak, impious rulers. The priests of Amun at Jebel Bakar delivered their oracles. Kush must intervene. Kush must save Egypt. Kush must restore Ma'at. Around 760 BCE, King Kashta made the first move. His armies crossed into Upper Egypt and occupied Thebes, the religious capital of Egypt and the center of Amun worship. Kashta didn't declare himself pharaoh of all Egypt, not yet, but he controlled Egypt's spiritual heart, and he forced Thebes to recognize his daughter as the god's wife of Amun, the most powerful religious office in Egypt. Kashta was testing the waters. His son Piye would dive in completely. In 727 BCE, the situation in Egypt reached a crisis. A Libyan chieftain named Tefnakht had united the Delta kingdoms and was pushing south, threatening Thebes and Kushite interest. The priests of Amun consulted the god, and the oracle was clear. Piye must march north. Piye didn't rush. He spent a year preparing, gathering his armies, stockpiling supplies, and ensuring he had the full backing of Amun's priesthood. Then in 727 BCE, he led his forces north on a campaign that would change Egyptian history forever. The victory, Stela of Piye, gives us an unprecedented account of the campaign. Piye's armies swept through Upper Egypt, accepting the surrender of city after city. When he reached Thebes, he performed elaborate religious rituals, presenting himself as a pious pharaoh rather than a foreign conqueror. But not everyone surrendered peacefully. Memphis, Egypt's ancient capital, refused to open its gates. Pierre laid siege to the city. When his scouts discovered that the Nile's flood had raised the water level on Memphis's northern side, supposedly the city's impregnable flank, Pierre launched a surprise attack. Cushite soldiers seized the docks, scaled the walls, and captured Memphis in a single bold assault. The fall of Memphis broke Egyptian resistance.